Good database migrations are kind of like unit tests in the sense that a lot of people don't actually do them very well, but like to walk around talking about how great they are.
I am an aggressive unit tester.
If you're wondering what the hell I'm talking about, this video is for you. Let's talk about database migrations. Let's jump right into an example. Let's say that we have a users table in our database, and the users table has a few fields. Might have an ID. Say users have a username, maybe a password. Anyways, let's say that we've deployed this application to production. So we actually have users. This table is being used in production by our web application. But what happens is now we want to add a new feature, and the new feature requires a new field in the database. Turns out now we need to add a new field. Let's call it birthday. The act of adding that field, of adding a new column to the table, that is a database migration. Now, this type of migration where we've add a new column or add a new table, it tends to be fairly safe. And the reason for that is the application that's been connected to this database and running queries, it didn't care about this birthday field before. It was never, say, querying, give me all of the users whose birthdays are before this date. It wasn't making those queries. By adding a new field, it's very unlikely that we'll break anything, right? By adding a new table to a database that's being used, very unlikely you'll break anything because the current code simply doesn't care about that database table because it just didn't exist in the last version. On the other hand, let's say we do a migration where we remove passwords from the users table, right? Maybe we're no longer storing user passwords because we only support sign in with Google, something like that. These types of migrations, right? Removals of data, I'll just do RM. They're very dangerous. They tend to be very dangerous. So let's talk through some rules of thumb about how you'd approach migrations depending on if your migration is adding a resource like a column or a table, deleting a column or a table, or updating, because this is going to change a lot, right? So let's assume that we're adding a new column or a new table. This tends to be safe. And so what you can do first to keep things simple is first you run the migration on the database. So you update the database, step number one, right? And by updating the database, you haven't broken what's currently running because you're just adding new stuff, right? Again, generally speaking. Okay. Number two, you'll update your code, right? Now you can deploy the new version of the application that actually uses those new fields or tables. Okay, now let's assume that you're deleting a column or a table. The first thing you're actually going to do in this case is update the code, right? So presumably you're deleting a column or a table from a database because you no longer need it in your application logic. Right? For whatever reason, you don't care about users' birthdays anymore, so we're just going to go ahead and delete it. Well, first you need to update the code. Stop querying that resource, right? Stop querying that column or that table. Once the code has been updated, now you can safely update the database without breaking anything. Now, let's talk about the thing that is by far the hardest. This is updating. Now, generally speaking, you should try just to not update. And what I mean is changing the name of a table is, generally speaking, just a really bad idea. Changing the name of a column, really bad. Try to get those things right the first time. But if you do have to change it, just know that it's going to be more work and you need to be extra careful. Because keep in mind, when we're adding stuff, we can safely update the database beforehand. When we're deleting stuff, we can safely update the database after the fact. When we're updating stuff, there's really no safe way. I mean, think about it for just a second. You've got an old version of code that expects an old database name and a new version of code that expects a new database name. Really, your only option is to make sure that you update both the database table name and the code at exactly the same moment in time. And it's really hard to make sure that happens. You're going to have probably milliseconds or seconds of downtime. So because this is a harder problem, there's not just a simple 1-2 solution. I'm going to just give a few ideas of how you can approach updating a database. Approach number one is schedule downtime. downtime. So this means you literally just turn off your application. You're like, look, customers, I'm sorry, you cannot access the application for the next 30 minutes. We're doing a big update to our database. I don't recommend that. That kind of sucks, right? People want access to your web application. So this is like what you would do if you really feel like you don't have any other options. It's simple, but it does affect your customers. Number 2 is kind of what I described at the start, which is just a same time deploy, right? So we're just going to deploy the update and we're going to deploy the code at the same time. We understand that there will be kind of a bug there for a few seconds. But if you've determined that, say, you don't have any active users at the moment, or a few seconds of issues aren't really a problem and it's not worth doing anything more complex, I mean, I've seen companies do this. I wouldn't say it's a good idea, but it does get the job done. The best approach, or the most robust approach, is probably to copy the database or the database table, right? So we create a new copy of the table with all the exact same data. We can update the new copy's name to be the new table, right? And now we can safely deploy the new code that references the new table. There is a possibility of, in the interim of you've done the copy and now you've deployed the new code, that new records will be added to the old table that you would also need to copy. But that can also be handled, right? You can write a fairly robust migration script that copies data to the new table, deploys the code, makes sure it moves over any records that were added in the interim, that sort of thing. So copying tends to be very robust. It takes a little more work, right? You're writing a more complex migration script to make sure that everything goes off without a hitch. Now, I know I just said that copying was the best approach, and I may have misspoke there. There actually is a better approach that I'm aware of. I'm going to call it aliasing. The thing is, sometimes aliasing is not possible. So there are certain databases that support an aliasing feature and some that don't. So it kind of just depends if this is available to you. But the whole idea behind aliasing is that you can give the table a second name. So your database table effectively has 2 names it can be referenced by. So what that means is your old code references the old name. You alias the table with a second name. So now it can be referenced by 2 different names. The new code uses the new name, right? And then once you've safely deployed the new code, you can drop the old name from the table. That would actually be the best, the safest, and the simplest approach, but it kind of depends on your database technology and what's available to you. These are just 4 options. These are the 4 that I've tended to use the most. Hopefully they help. And then I just want to reiterate that you shouldn't be updating names very often, right? Pick good table names, pick good column names, try to do adds and deletes, and avoid updates. Now, the last thing we need to talk about with database migrations are up and down migrations, right? So we talked about the different types of migrations in the sense that you can add something, delete it, or update it. But realistically, any migration that brings us forward in time, we call an up migration, right? So our first up migration might create a table, right? And then our second migration might delete, I should say our second up migration might delete a column from that table, right? Our third up migration might create a new table, create another table. Now let's say our fourth up migration renames a column, and then maybe our last migration deletes a table. Okay, those are all up migrations, and in theory, the latest running or the current running version of our application will just use the latest version of the up migrations. In other words, it will have run every single up migration in order to arrive at kind of the final state of the database, the one that's running in production. Now, a down migration is really just used to roll back changes in the case of emergency or in the case that something goes wrong. So you don't plan to use your down migrations. You just kind of have them as a backup. And frankly, this is why at the very beginning of the video, I talked about how people talk about great migrations, but oftentimes they don't employ them. not every company has great plans for down migrations. Just to speak frankly, it's more robust to have great down migrations so that you can roll up your database and roll down your database, bring it forward and backward in time. But it's a lot of work, right? So you won't necessarily always see, teams that have fantastic down migrations. But let's just talk about what they'd look like. So a down migration is very simply just the opposite of its kind of related up migration. So when you add a new table, you might also log a down migration that deletes that same table. So delete table. Here we'd have add column, right? We're just doing the inverse of the equivalent up migration. The third down migration would delete a table again, delete table. The fourth would rename the column back to whatever it was, right? It would invert this up migration. And then finally here, we would have an add table command. And that's a 5. Why did I write 6? There we go. Okay, so the theory is I can go all the way up to the latest version by running these up migrations in order. And if I need to go back a version, I can just run the equivalent down migration, right? So I get up to the latest, and then I say, oh crap, I need to roll back to the last version of my database. I can just run this down migration number 5 to re-add that table that I just deleted.